The commander grabbed the youngest soldier by the collar and dragged him forward like a rag doll. "Tell me where your sniper is hiding," he said, his voice almost gentle, almost kind. "Tell me, and I'll let him live." The boy said nothing, so the commander pressed the barrel of his pistol against the soldier's temple and cocked it slowly, making sure every member of Echo Squad heard the click. He smiled at the others. He had no idea that 2 kilometers away, across a field of frozen silence, someone was already watching him through a scope. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story to the end. And drop a comment. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came in first. Not the kind of cold that bites at exposed skin or stings the eyes. This was the kind that enters through the lungs, settles in the chest, and stays there like a second heartbeat. The kind that makes a person slow down without meaning to. The kind that has killed more soldiers than any bullet ever fired in this part of the world. Sergeant Raina Hale had been lying in position for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew the exact number because she had counted her breaths, a habit, from training, a ritual from survival. Her body barely moved. Her breathing was shallow and controlled. From 50 meters away, she would have been invisible. From 500, she was nothing. From 2,000, she didn't exist. That was the point. Echo Squad moved below her in a staggered formation. 6 soldiers cutting through a frozen marshland that stretched out like cracked glass in every direction. The marsh was deceptive. It looked like solid ground until it wasn't. The ice was thin in places, thick in others, and there was no pattern to it. No reliable rule. Every step had to be deliberate. Every boot placement had to be calculated. One wrong move and the ground disappeared. Raina tracked them from the ridge, her scope sweeping left to right in slow, methodical arcs. She never looked at the squad directly. She looked past them, beyond them, at the spaces between the tree lines and the shadows that didn't quite belong to the terrain. Something felt wrong. She couldn't name it yet. That was the most dangerous kind of wrong. "Overwatch, you seeing anything?" The voice crackled in her earpiece. Staff Sergeant Dolan, he was leading the ground element today, experienced, steady, the kind of soldier who didn't rattle easily. "We've got a clean visual down here. Wind's picking up from the northwest." "Copy that," Raina said, keeping her voice flat. "I'm seeing clean. Keep pace." She said it because she had nothing concrete to report. Nothing she could point to with coordinates and confidence. But she pressed her eye harder against the scope and slowed her breathing down another degree. The marsh was too quiet. That was what was wrong. She understood it now, the way you sometimes understand things only after your body has already decided to be afraid. There were no birds, no distant calls, no wing movement in the tree line, no small signs of wildlife disturbed by the squad's passing. Animals didn't go quiet in empty terrain. Animals went quiet when something else was already there. "Dolan," she said quietly, "hold your position. Something's off." There was a pause. She heard boots crunching to a stop. "Define off, Sam," he said. "I can't yet. Just hold." She swept the scope wide, left tree line, right tree line, the frozen ridge line on the far end of the marsh. She was looking for irregularities, shapes that didn't belong, shadows that moved against the wind, reflections off surfaces that should have been matte. There, left tree line, a faint glint, gone in less than a second. But she caught it, then another, right side, lower, closer. "Dolan, break formation, move your team." The smoke grenades came from 4 directions simultaneously. She heard the impacts before she saw the smoke, 4 hollow cracks in the frozen air, almost musical in their spacing, almost choreographed. White smoke billowed instantly, thick and fast, swallowing the squad's position in under 3 seconds. Professional deployment, military grade, the kind of precision that came from training and from rehearsal. "Contact. Contact multiple." Dolan's voice cut through the radio, then disappeared under a burst of static. Raina was already moving her scope. The attackers emerged from the tree lines in a coordinated pincer. She counted 8 on the left, 6 on the right, 2 more cutting off the rear. She couldn't see the front yet. Her finger rested against the trigger guard, not on the trigger. Not yet. She needed a clear shot. Through the smoke, she couldn't separate friends from threats. "Dolan, get me a position." "I don't have eyes," she said. Nothing on the radio. Static. She heard shooting, short control bursts. Not panic trained. These weren't militia. These were soldiers. Every movement she could see through the swirling smoke was deliberate. They were using the smoke as cover in both directions. It blinded Reyna as much as it blinded Echo Squad. The smoke began to thin at the edges. She caught a gap. One attacker 20 meters from Dolan's last position, moving in a low crouch. She fired. The figure dropped. She cycled the bolt, found the next target, another attacker cutting across the open marsh ice. She fired again. The second figure went down hard, one leg collapsing before the rest. But it wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. She could see it happening even through the obscured scope view. Echo Squad wasn't being killed. They were being herded. Pushed together, boxed in, surrounded from all sides with precision that meant this had been planned for them, specifically for this route, for this time window. Someone had known exactly where Echo Squad would be. "Reyna!" A voice broke through the static. Private Yoon, the youngest member of the squad, barely 22, with more courage than experience. They've got Kovac. They're pulling him back. They're not shooting to kill. They want us alive. Yoon, stay down, stay. The radio cut again. She fired twice more. Both shots connected. But for every attacker she dropped, two more held their positions, keeping the pressure tight and constant. They weren't charging in recklessly. They were managing the space. They were professionals doing a job they had rehearsed. And then she saw why they didn't need to charge. Through a brief gap in the smoke, she saw Dolan hands zip-tied behind his back, a knee in the middle of his spine, his face pressed against the ice. He was alive. He wasn't struggling. He knew better than to struggle against four weapons pointed at close range. They were taking prisoners, every single member of Echo Squad. The realization hit her like something physical. This wasn't an ambush meant to destroy the squad. It was meant to collect them, alive. Whatever the enemy wanted from Echo Squad, they needed them breathing. Reyna had her scope on the man holding Dolan down, heavy gear. Confident posture, the body language of command. She could take the shot. She almost did. Her finger moved to the trigger. But taking that shot meant revealing her exact position. And if they knew where she was, they would redirect. They would come for her too. And then there would be no one left on the outside. She pulled her finger back. Her whole body was screaming at her. Every instinct she had trained for years was shouting to fire, to act, to do something. But there was another part of her, the cold, calculating part, that had kept her alive through 3 deployments in more bad situations than she could count. And that part was already calculating something else. She pulled back from the ridge edge, moving on her elbows and knees, staying below the sight line. She needed to relocate. She needed elevation and concealment in a new angle before the smoke cleared completely and the attackers began their own sweep. She was 10 meters from the ridge when the ice gave way beneath her. No warning, no creak, no preliminary groan. One moment she was moving across what she had assumed was solid ground. She had checked it visually when she first established position. It had seemed stable, and then the surface simply collapsed beneath her right leg, and she dropped straight through. The water hit her like a wall. It didn't feel cold at first. That's what people who've never fallen through ice into freezing water don't understand. The first sensation isn't cold. It's a full-body shock, like every nerve in your body firing at once, like the air being punched out of your lungs simultaneously. She went under. The weight of her gear pulled her down faster than she expected. She twisted violently, fighting the instinct to gasp, because gasping underwater meant flooding her lungs, and got one arm up through the hole she'd fallen through. The ice edge crumbled when she grabbed it. She went under again. Her rifle was still strapped across her chest, dead weight in the water. She could drop it. She should drop it. Every rational thought told her the rifle was going to kill her right now. She didn't drop it. She twisted again this time, pushing off the bottom shallow enough to push off just barely, and came up through the broken ice at an angle. Her elbow caught a solid section. She held. She pulled. Every muscle she had worked for in 3 years of special operations training screamed and answered. She pulled herself out. She lay on the ice for 4 seconds. Exactly 4 seconds she counted before forcing herself to move. Because lying still in wet gear in sub-zero temperatures was a death sentence measured in minutes. She crawled, then she stood, then she moved. She made the tree line. She was alone. When she finally stopped moving and pressed her back against a thick pine trunk and allowed herself 30 seconds to assess, she understood the full weight of what had just happened. She ran a hand along her rifle. The scope was intact, the barrel clear, the mechanism functional despite the submersion. Small mercies. She was soaked through her base layers and the outer gear was already stiffening with ice crystals forming at the seams. Her hands were wrong, not numb wrong. That distinction mattered. Numb was fixable. Wrong meant the early stages of something more serious. She pressed her palms hard against her thighs, generating friction, forcing blood back toward her fingers. She couldn't afford to lose her hands. Not today. She pulled out her thermal scope and scanned back toward the marsh. The smoke was nearly gone. The attackers were consolidating their prisoners. She could count them now. She counted 6 figures from Echo Squad, hands bound, being moved in a tight group. 6. That was the whole squad. Every single one of them taken alive exactly as planned. And then she saw the direction they were heading. Northeast, into the deepest part of the controlled territory. She had a rough map of this area from their pre-mission briefing. Northeast meant the old ranger station, a fortified structure about 3 kilometers out, built into the hillside, reinforced, defensible. If they got Echo Squad inside that building, getting them out would require a full extraction team, and air support, and a lot of time that nobody had. She had none of those things. She had herself 1 rifle, 31 rounds remaining to the shots she'd fired in the marsh, a thermal scope, wet gear, compromised body temperature, and 3 kilometers of enemy-controlled, frozen terrain between her and her squad. She stood up and started moving. She didn't think about the odds. She had learned long ago that thinking about odds was a trap. It led to paralysis, to waiting for a better calculation that never came. She thought instead about angles, about terrain, about cover and sight lines, and what the ground was going to look like between here and the ranger station. She moved in long parallel arcs to the enemy column's path. Never directly behind them. That was how you got caught. She kept distance and used the tree line to stay concealed, tracking them through the thermal scope every 3 to 4 minutes. She could see their heat signatures even through the trees. 6 prisoners in a cluster. 12 guards spread in a perimeter. 2 out front, 2 in the rear. The rest flanking. They were good. Whoever these people were, they were very good. She had been moving for 40 minutes when she first noticed the lead guard doing something that didn't fit. He would stop every few minutes and turn, scanning the area behind the column. Not the casual check of someone going through routine, a deliberate, targeted scan. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for a tail. He was looking for her, which meant they knew she hadn't been captured. They knew there was a sniper unaccounted for, and they were already worried about it. Good, she thought. Let them worry. She adjusted her angle, moving wider, putting more trees between herself and the column. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to slow down. They were covering ground fast, and she needed to reach a position ahead of them, not behind them. Her thermal scope showed the heat signatures of the prisoners. She could identify some of them by their builds and movement patterns. Dolan moved with a slight forward lean, even when his hands were bound. Kovac was the biggest heat signature in the group. She found Yoon at the rear of the prisoner cluster, moving with a limp. He'd been hurt in the initial contact. Not severely, but enough. "I see you," she said quietly to no one. She kept moving. She was crossing a section of firmer ground away from the marsh into the forested slope that led up toward the higher terrain when her boots snagged on something buried under the snow. She caught herself before falling, dropping to one knee and looked down. Wire. Nearly invisible under 3 centimeters of fresh snowfall. Thin-gauge military spec. Tripwire. She followed it with her eyes carefully without touching to a small device attached to a pine root about 2 meters to her right. Alarm, not explosive. They'd seeded the approach routes. They were more prepared than she'd given them credit for. She stepped over the wire with surgical precision and kept moving. But her mind was working now at a different level. If they had wired the approach routes, they had anticipated a potential rescue attempt. They had planned for the possibility that not everyone would be captured. They had built contingencies. She was operating inside someone else's plan, and she needed to understand that plan well enough to break it. She stopped. She found a position between 2 large pines and crouched, taking 60 seconds to do nothing but think. The ambush had been precise. The route had been known. The timing had been exact, which meant there was intelligence, real intelligence, not guesswork. Someone with access to Echo Squad's operational plans had provided this information. Someone on the inside. Someone with clearance. She pushed that thought aside. It was important. It would matter later. Right now, it was a distraction. What mattered right now was that the ranger station was approximately 2 kilometers ahead of the column's current position, and she was running out of time to find a shot. Once Echo Squad was inside those walls, the game changed entirely. She needed high ground. She needed it now. She shifted course and began climbing. The slope was steep and the snow was inconsistent. Packed in some places, loose in others, and twice, she sank past her knee and had to wrench herself free. Her wet gear was pulling heat from her core at a rate she could feel. She was burning calories she didn't have. Her hands had stopped being wrong and graduated to something closer to numb, which paradoxically was slightly better. It meant the surface nerves had shut down and the deep function was still intact. She reached a rocky outcropping near the ridgeline and pulled herself over the last ledge by sheer grip strength, and she stopped. Below her, the terrain opened up in a way she hadn't seen on the maps from the briefing, because maps don't tell you everything. The marshland she'd started on was behind her now. Ahead, the ground dropped into a long, wide valley that stretched toward the northeast, and at the far end of that valley, built into the base of the next hillside, was the ranger station. She could see it clearly even at this distance. Lights were on inside. Vehicles were parked on the approach. People were moving on the exterior guards, multiple positions covering the approaches. She brought up her scope. The column was still moving, still about 1 kilometer from the station entrance. She had time. Not much, but enough to find a better position and begin her calculations. She started mapping wind. She tied 3 strands of her own hair pulled from the edge of her balaclava to a low branch nearby. The hairs moved constantly, responding to the layered air currents that moved differently at ground level than at height. She watched them for 2 full minutes. She observed the snowdrift patterns on the rocks below. She watched the tree line at the far side of the valley, noting how the highest branches moved compared to the mid-level branches. The wind was the problem. The wind was always the problem. At long range, wind was not a single variable. It was a column of different forces stacked on top of each other, each blowing at different speeds, and sometimes in marginally different directions. A bullet traveling at extreme range didn't move through one wind, it moved through dozens. You had to model all of them simultaneously, calculating an aggregate correction that was more art than science. She had done this before. She had never done it from this far. She checked the distance reading from her scope's laser rangefinder. The main structure of the ranger station, 2,897 meters. She read the number twice, 2,897 meters. She set her jaw and started working the calculation. Below her, the prisoner column kept moving through the frozen valley. She had 20 minutes, maybe less. She began adjusting her scope turrets, working through the mathematics in her head. Elevation correction for the bullet drop at extreme range wind. Correction based on her layered air assessment, temperature correction for the effect of cold air on muzzle velocity, even a small correction for the Coriolis effect, which at this distance was no longer negligible. The numbers were brutal. The margin for error was measured in centimeters across nearly 3 kilometers of unstable atmosphere. The slightest miscalculation in wind speed and the bullet's actual velocity and the angle of the barrel, relative to true level, meant a miss by meters, and she only had 31 rounds. She wouldn't get 31 attempts. She would get 1, maybe 2 if the first one disrupted the formation enough to buy her a second. She settled into position, felt her breathing slow without consciously trying to slow it. She found her anchor, her body pressed against the rock, her support hand firm under the stock, her cheek welded to the comb. She looked through the scope. At the far end of the valley, nearly 3 kilometers away, she could see the ranger station in crisp detail. She could see guards. She could see vehicles. She could see the door where they would bring the prisoners in. She could see the commander. He was standing outside the main structure facing the approaching column. He was watching them come in, overseeing the delivery of his prize. His posture was relaxed, satisfied. He didn't look like a man who expected trouble. He had no idea she existed. She tracked him for a long moment, letting her crosshairs settle on his center of mass, feeling the natural rhythm of her own heartbeat in the subtle rise and fall of the scope's image. She breathed. She counted. She waited for the pause between heartbeats, the moment of absolute stillness that every long-range shooter learns to find. The prisoner column reached the outer perimeter of the station. She saw them begin to push Dolan forward. Yoon stumbled and was shoved upright by a guard's hand. Kovac turned and said something she couldn't hear it from here, would never hear it, but she recognized the posture of a man who was still fighting even with his hands bound. The commander turned away from her direction and walked toward the prisoners. She adjusted her point of aim. She breathed out. She found the stillness. Her finger moved to the trigger. Her finger was on the trigger, and the whole world had narrowed to a single point of pressure. Not yet. She eased back. The prisoner column was still moving through the outer perimeter. The guards were distracted, watching the prisoners managing the handoff, doing what people do when they believe they've already won. The commander had walked toward the entrance of the main structure and stopped to speak to someone she couldn't fully see. His back was partially turned. His shoulders were squared toward the door. Not the shot she needed, not yet. She forced herself to wait. Waiting was the hardest skill any sniper ever learned. It wasn't passive. It was a full-body act of controlled violence, holding every instinct down by the throat while the clock ate through the margins. She had trained for it. She had hated it every single time. She hated it now. The column stopped 20 meters from the entrance. A guard at the front was speaking into a radio. Procedure. They were running through their own protocol before bringing the prisoners inside. Every second they stood in the open was a second she could use. She watched the commander turn back around. Full profile, center mass, clean. She breathed out halfway and stopped. Her crosshairs settled on the point just below his left collarbone, adjusted 3 inches right for the wind correction she had calculated across the layered air column. She felt the pause between her heartbeats arrive, that suspended fraction of a second, when the body is in between motions between the systole and the diastole, when a trained shooter is as close to a machine as a human being ever gets. She pressed the trigger straight back. The rifle fired. 4 seconds of silence. She was already cycling the bolt when she heard faintly at the very edge of what was audible at this distance, the delayed sound of impact, not a crack, more like a shift in the quality of the air. Something heavy and immediate had changed at the far end of the valley. She looked back through the scope. The commander was on the ground. For 1 full second, nothing else moved. The guards near the prisoners stood exactly where they had been standing, their minds still processing what had just happened, their bodies not yet receiving the signal to act. That second was the most dangerous and most valuable second of the entire operation. She was already finding her second target. The guard closest to Dolan, the one with the best angle to execute a prisoner. If the situation turned, she put her crosshairs on him before the first second was up and fired. He went down. Now the station erupted, shouting, bodies scattering in all directions. The guards near the prisoners pulled them inward, using them as shields, which was exactly what she had anticipated. She didn't take another shot at the prisoner cluster. She shifted to the communication array, mounted on the near wall of the station, the external antenna, the radio relay box visible at the corner of the building. She fired twice. The first round clipped the mounting bracket. The second destroyed the relay box entirely. No external communications. No calling for reinforcements from outside the valley. Whatever they were going to do now, they were going to do it with only the people already on the ground. She counted those people quickly. 12, she could confirm, possibly more inside. She had 24 rounds left. "Come on, Dolan," she whispered. "Fight back." As if he could hear her across 3 kilometers of frozen air, Dolan moved. He dropped his weight, suddenly catching the guard holding him completely off balance, and drove his bound hands upward into the man's jaw. Not elegant, his wrists were still locked together, but brutal and effective. The guard staggered. Dolan kicked him in the knee and arm, and the guard went sideways. Kovac, seeing the opening, spun and put his full weight into a shoulder charge against the man to his right. Echo Squad was fighting back. It was the most chaotic 2 minutes she had ever tried to support from a distance. She couldn't fire into the melee without risking her own people. She had to wait for clean angles, and clean angles lasted for fractions of a second before bodies crossed in front of them again. She fired when she could. She held when she had to. She took down 2 more guards who had separated from the prisoner cluster and were trying to flank from the left side of the structure. 4 confirmed, 6 rounds expended. Then Yoon did something that stopped her breathing entirely. He broke away from the group, not towards safety, toward the building. He ran directly at the entrance, still with his hands zip-tied, and threw himself through the door before any guard could react. She had no idea what he was doing. There was no logical reason to run toward the building when every instinct said, run away from it. "Yoon," she said, her voice tight. "Yoon, what are you doing?" She couldn't reach him. She couldn't communicate with any of them. Her radio had been compromised when she went into the water, the earpiece working intermittently at best. She had one-way fragments of transmission, nothing reliable in the other direction. She swept the scope across the station exterior, accounting for every body she could see. The prisoner cluster had partially broken. Dolan and Kobach were together moving toward the south side of the station where a vehicle was parked. Two other squad members, she identified them as Reyes and Blackwood, were in a struggle with three guards near the fence line. The last squad member, a quiet, methodical soldier named Ferris, who she had worked with on two previous deployments, was on the ground. She didn't know if he was alive. She put the scope back on the main entrance looking for Yoon. Nothing, he was inside. She forced herself to refocus on what she could control. She had 18 rounds left in a fight that was actively evolving at 3 kilometers. She needed to suppress the guards who were regrouping. She could see 3 of them pulling back to a covered position near the north corner of the station, setting up what looked like a defensive line. If they got organized, they would retake control of the situation within minutes. She fired 3 shots in rapid succession at the position, not trying to hit anything specific, just disrupting their ability to settle. Rocks and ice exploded near the corner. The guards scattered again. Good. Keep them moving. Keep them from thinking. Then the twist came from a direction she never expected. A vehicle started moving on the far side of the station. Not one of the parked trucks she had already cataloged. This one had come from behind the building from a position she hadn't been able to see from her current angle. A heavier vehicle. Military spec. It moved fast, cutting across the station approach, heading not toward the prisoner cluster, but toward the southeast corner of the valley, toward the extraction route. They were trying to block the exit. She swung her scope hard right and tracked the vehicle. It was moving too fast for a precise hit at this distance, bouncing across frozen ground, but she led it by her best estimate of speed and direction and fired twice. The first round struck the hood. The second, she couldn't tell where the second hit. But the vehicle fishtailed, corrected, and kept moving. She had 15 rounds left. The vehicle reached the southeast pass before she could stop it and halted across the only viable ground exit from the valley. 2 men climbed out and set up a position behind it. She had just lost the ground exit. She let herself feel that for exactly 1 second, the cold weight of a tactical situation getting worse despite every correct decision she was making, and then she moved on. If ground exit was blocked, extraction would have to be air. But calling in air support required communication she didn't have. She had no radio that was functioning reliably. She had no way to reach the command element and request helicopter extraction. Unless someone inside the station could. Yoon. That was why he had run for the building. She understood it now with a clarity that hit her like a physical shock. Yoon had run for the communications equipment inside the station. Not the external relay she had destroyed, but whatever internal systems a ranger station of that type would carry. Landline backup, satellite handset, emergency beacon, something. He had run toward the building because he understood in the chaos of those few seconds that communications were the only path to getting everyone out alive. He was 22 years old with a busted leg and his hands tied, and he had made the most tactically sophisticated decision on the field. She felt something raw and protective move through her chest. "Come out alive," she said quietly. "You hear me? Come out alive." She turned her attention back to the exterior. Dolan and Kobach had reached the vehicle on the south side. She could see Dolan working on something, trying to get the vehicle door open or trying to free his own wrists. From this distance, she couldn't tell which. The guards near the fence were still occupied with Reyes and Blackwood, but the numbers weren't right. 3 guards against 2 bound soldiers was going to resolve badly within the next 60 seconds. She aimed at the guard, applying the most direct pressure on Reyes, and fired. 13 rounds left. The guard dropped. The remaining 2 backed off involuntarily, the instinct to locate the shooter overriding their immediate objective. Reyes and Blackwood moved not running, because running on uncertain ice with bound hands was how you broke a leg, but moving fast in a controlled stumble toward the south side where Dolan and Kobach were. 4 of her squad members were consolidating. 1 was down and she still didn't know his status. 1 was inside a hostile building doing something she couldn't see. She swept back to Ferris. He had moved. He was crawling, slowly with one arm not tracking right, suggesting injury. But he was moving. He was alive. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the past 3 minutes. A guard came around the corner of the building on a direct intercept course for Ferris. Fast, aggressive, weapon up. The man had spotted Ferris and was covering the distance at a run. She fired. 12 rounds left. The guard went down hard 3 meters from Ferris. Ferris didn't stop moving, didn't look back. Just kept crawling toward the south side. Good man, she thought. Keep going. The temperature had dropped another degree in the past 20 minutes. She could feel it despite everything else that was happening, the way the air had gone denser, heavier, the kind of cold that announces itself as a presence. Her fingers on the trigger hand were functioning, barely but functioning. She had been clenching and releasing her support hand every few minutes to keep blood moving, an automatic habit she'd developed years ago. It was working, marginally. Don't think about it, she told herself. There's only the scope and the shot. There's only the scope and the shot. She found a new position slightly to her left. She had been lying in the same exact spot for too long, and professional soldiers would eventually triangulate her position from the shots she'd been firing. She moved 10 meters, reestablished her anchor, and brought the scope back up. The south side of the station looked different now. Dolan had gotten the vehicle door open and had somehow, she still didn't know how, with bound hands gotten the engine started. Kovac was at the rear of the vehicle. Reyes and Blackwood had reached them. She watched Blackwood use her teeth to grip the plastic of Dolan's zip tie, while Dolan wrenched his wrists apart, an ugly, painful process that she'd seen people fail at more often than succeed. But Dolan's hands came free. He immediately took Blackwood's wrists and worked on her restraints. They were getting themselves together, without her, without any support from outside. They were doing what Echo Squad did, which was adapt to the situation with whatever was on the ground. She felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, something between the two, more complicated than either. Then the station's front door opened, and a guard came out dragging someone. Yoon. He was on his feet, barely moving under his own power, but being directed by the grip on his collar. The guard walked him to the center of the open area in front of the station and stopped. And then the guard raised his weapon and pressed it against Yoon's head, and he shouted something at the surrounding terrain. Shouted it in English. "Sniper, show yourself, or the boy dies. You have 30 seconds. She went absolutely still. The entire tactical situation compressed into a single point. The guard couldn't see her. He was shouting in the general direction of the ridgeline, sweeping his gaze across a few hundred meters of slope, not knowing where she actually was. He was bluffing on the specifics, but he wasn't bluffing on the weapon. Yoon didn't struggle. He stood very straight, his jaw set, his eyes forward. He knew exactly what was happening, and he was choosing how to hold himself in the moment. She had seen soldiers twice his age fall apart in situations like this. He didn't fall apart. But his hands weren't tied anymore. She looked more carefully. She could see at this extreme magnification that his wrists had slackened them. The zip tie was still there, but it had been cut or loosened from the inside. He had found something in the building and worked his restraints. He was standing in a specific posture because he was concealing what his hands could do. He was waiting. 20 seconds, the guard shouted. She did not move. She did not stand up. She did not give away her position. Instead, she put her crosshairs exactly where they needed to be, and she waited with him. The guard pressed the weapon harder against Yoon's temple, and she could see Yoon flinch involuntarily the way any person flinches when cold metal is pressed into their skull, and then he recovered. 10 seconds. From inside the vehicle on the south side, she could see Dolan had gone still. He had heard the guard. He was watching. 5. Yoon moved. It was faster than someone who had been through the past hour should have been able to move. He dropped his weight straight down the same direction as gravity, the one direction you can move that doesn't require clearing the weapon's line of fire. The zip tie on his wrist split completely as he threw both arms out, and he hit the ground in a controlled fall and rolled hard to his left. She fired in the same instant. The guard was already tracking Yoon's movement, bringing the weapon down when the round arrived. He dropped without completing the motion. 11 rounds left. Yoon was on the ground flat, not moving for 2 seconds, and then he pushed up to his hands and knees and began moving toward the south side in the low scramble of someone who understood exactly how exposed he was. "Go," she said. "Go, go, go." 3 more guards appeared from the north side of the station, moving in a coordinated push, covering each other. These weren't panicking anymore. They had regrouped, they had a leader directing them, and they were coming in a formation that was going to be very difficult to manage from one position. She fired at the lead guard, missed the crosswind, shifted in the half-second between the trigger pull and the bullet's arrival, throwing her calculation by enough. She adjusted, fired again. The second round hit, 9 rounds left. The remaining 2 guards split and went to cover positions on either side of the approach, which was tactically correct and made them significantly harder to engage. She could see one of them behind a concrete barrier near the station wall. She waited for an angle and took a shot when the man leaned out to assess. 8 rounds. The other guard was out of her current angle, entirely behind a structure she couldn't see past from this position. She would have to move again. She began shifting her position, staying low, moving in the crawl that had become her natural mode of existence over the past 2 hours. She found a new angle on the second guard and fired. 7 rounds. The south side vehicle started moving. Dolan had gotten them loaded. She could see 6 heat signatures in and around the vehicle. All of them. Yoon included all 6 members of Echo Squad packed into a single vehicle moving toward the valley floor, moving away from the blocked ground exit to the southeast, moving instead toward the northwest, the direction of the approach road, the direction that led back toward friendly territory. But there were still 2 armed men at the blocked southeast pass, and the northwest route wasn't clear either. She had seen a guard take position somewhere on that side during the initial chaos and hadn't confirmed his current location. She swept the northwest approach, found the guard. He was prone behind a rock formation on the left side of the track, weapon aimed directly at the only path the vehicle could take. She fired. 6 rounds left. The path was clear, but it wasn't going to stay clear. The vehicle was exposed on open ground, and there were still armed men at the station who would give chase. She needed to keep suppression on the station long enough for the vehicle to clear the valley. She fired 2 more shots at the station entrance, keeping heads down. 4 rounds left. The vehicle was moving faster now, Dolan pushing it hard across uneven terrain. She tracked it, watching it close the distance toward the northwest exit of the valley. 400 meters, 300. She kept her scope split between the vehicle and the station, firing once more when a guard tried to bring up a long weapon from the north corner. 3 rounds, 200 meters from the valley exit. A sound reached her, distant, low rhythmic. She knew that sound. She had spent enough time in enough bad places to know that sound instantly without looking for its source. Rotors. Someone had gotten the call out. Yoon had gotten the call out from inside the station. The helicopters were coming in, but they were coming in from the north, and they were still at least 6 to 8 minutes out by the sound profile. The vehicle was going to reach the valley exit before the helicopters arrived, which meant there was going to be a window where Echo Squad was on foot outside the vehicle in open terrain waiting for air extraction. That window was the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. She had 3 rounds. She had to make them count. The vehicle stopped at the northwest exit and the doors opened, and she watched her squad pile out. Dolan immediately took a defensive position. Kovac grabbed Ferris and pulled him toward a low rock formation. Yoon was limping badly now. Whatever adrenaline had been carrying him had begun to wear off, and the leg injury was demanding its toll. Reyes guided him toward cover. Blackwood was already up and scanning weapon she had recovered from somewhere in hand, adding to their defensive capability. From the station, pursuit was organizing. She could see 2 vehicles starting up headlights, cutting through the frozen air. She put her 3 remaining rounds into the engine block of the first pursuit vehicle. The vehicle rolled to a stop 30 meters from the station. The second vehicle hesitated. The rotors grew louder. She watched the helicopters appear over the northern ridgeline, 2 Blackhawks coming in low and fast the way they always came in when they knew they were landing in a hot zone. The lead aircraft was already banking toward Echo Squad's position. She could see the crew chief in the side door weapon out covering the approach. The second pursuit vehicle made its decision and stayed where it was. Smart, she thought. Whatever this operation had been, whatever these people had planned and executed with such precision, they didn't want Blackhawks. Nobody with a light truck and 6 riflemen wanted to be underneath 2 Blackhawks with door gunners. She watched her squad load. Dolan went last, counting heads, making sure every one of his people was aboard before he stepped onto the skid. She saw him look back across the valley, scanning the ridgeline. He couldn't see her. She was 1,000 meters away behind rocks and snow, and she had barely moved in the past 2 hours. But he looked anyway, like he knew she was there, like he wanted her to know he knew. The helicopter lifted. The valley was suddenly very quiet again. She lay still for a long moment, her rifle empty, now her hands finally beginning to register what she had been putting them through. The cold settled back around her, fully filling the space that adrenaline had been occupying, and she let herself feel it completely for the first time. Her body was running on reserve she hadn't known she had. She needed to move. She needed to get to a position where she could signal the second helicopter, the one still circling, and get herself extracted before she became another problem for someone to solve. She pushed herself upright. Her legs were stiff. Her hands ached with a specific deep muscle pain that she recognized as the kind that wouldn't fully resolve for days. She was wet and cold, and she had been functioning at the edge of what the human body could sustain for close to 3 hours. She started moving toward the extraction point, and she did not look back at the valley. Not because there was nothing worth looking at, but because she already knew what she had done there, and she didn't need to see it again to carry it with her. She moved through the dark the way she always moved, low, deliberate, each step placed before her weight committed to it. The second Black Hawk had circled twice before the crew chief spotted her signal. She had used the last thing she had that produced light, a chemical marker from her vest pocket, cracked and pressed against the snow. Green light, dull but enough. The helicopter dropped to 3 meters, and she pulled herself aboard without assistance, without asking for a hand, the way she had always done everything. The crew chief grabbed her arm anyway. She let him. The helicopter banked hard, and the valley disappeared beneath her, and she sat with her back against the cold metal wall and held her rifle across her knees and didn't speak. The crew chief said something. She saw his mouth moving. The rotor noise made it impossible without the headset, and the headset was at the far end of the cabin. She didn't move to get it. He looked at her for a moment the way people look at someone they're not sure is completely intact, and then he left her alone. That was the right call. She needed 40 seconds of nothing. She took them. Her hands had stopped functioning correctly somewhere in the last push to the extraction point. Not dangerous, she could still close her fingers, still grip, still feel pressure, but the fine motor control that a sniper's hands depended on had gone soft and imprecise, like trying to write with gloves on. She pressed them flat against her thighs and felt the heat from her own legs begin to transfer. Slow, not enough, but something. She was alive. Her squad was alive. She ran that through her head, once let it settle, and then pushed it aside because there were still things that needed thinking. The insider. Someone with access to Echo Squad's operational route had provided that information to a hostile force capable of planning and executing a professional-grade ambush on short notice. That was not a small thing. That was not a mistake or a coincidence. That was a decision someone had made deliberately, and that someone was still inside the system, still protected by clearance and proximity, still standing somewhere warm and unaccounted for. When the helicopter touched down at the forward operating base, she was the first one out. The base was lit and awake, which meant word had reached command before the helicopters landed. She could see Colonel Marcus Webb standing outside the medical tent with 2 staff officers she didn't recognize, and a look on his face that occupied the complicated space between professional relief and personal discomfort. Webb had always been uncomfortable around her. She had never cared enough to examine why. She walked past the medical team that approached her and went directly to Webb. "My squad," she said, "landed 7 minutes ahead of you. Ferris is in surgery through and through on the left shoulder. They're saying he'll keep the arm. The rest are being assessed." He paused. "Hale, you need to." "Who knew our route?" He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes that she cataloged immediately, not guilt, not surprise. Calculation. He was deciding how much to say. "That's under investigation," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." He put a hand on her arm gently but with intention, a gesture meant to redirect rather than comfort. "Get to medical. We'll debrief in 2 hours." She looked at him for a long moment, then she went to medical. The medic who examined her was young and efficient and didn't make conversation, which she appreciated. Core temperature low but not critical. Hands superficial nerve impact from cold exposure, expected full function within 48 hours. Multiple contusions from the icefall. One rib that responded badly to pressure, bruised not broken probably. She didn't mention that her right shoulder had been screaming for the last hour from the repeated bolt cycling in freezing temperatures. "Some things you managed yourself," They gave her dry clothes, hot fluids, and a wool blanket. She sat on the edge of a cot and drank the hot liquid without tasting it and tried not to think about the inside of the ice water for the 100th time. The tent flap opened and Dolan walked in. He wasn't supposed to be out of assessment yet. He was still in his field gear. His face cut in two places, dried blood on his chin that hadn't been cleaned. He looked at her across the small space between the cot and the entrance, and then he walked over and sat down next to her on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I looked for you. On the ridge. I knew you were up there." "I know," she said. "I saw you look." "That shot." He stopped. Tried again. "Raina, that shot. It worked. Nearly 3 kilometers in that wind." He shook his head, not in disbelief, more like a man trying to fit something large into a frame that wasn't built for it. "I had guys start counting after the commander went down. They counted the seconds. 4 seconds before impact. 4 seconds. 4.1, she said. "I calculated 4.1. He looked at her. She looked at her hands. "Yoon," she said. "How is he?" "Legs bad. He's not going to be field ready for 6 weeks minimum. But you know how he is. He's sitting up and arguing with the medic about whether he needs an IV. A sound came out of Dolan that was almost a laugh. He got to a satellite handset in the back office of that station. Took him 4 minutes with his hands half-tied. Called it in himself. I figured. How? He ran toward the building once, she said. Nobody does that by accident. Dolan was quiet again. Then he said, the lightness gone from his voice, "Someone sold us out Raina." "Yes. That ambush was built around our exact route, exact timing. They had our window down to the minute. That's not field intelligence. That's operational access," she said. "Someone with our mission file. Webb's running it through channels." Webb was too calm when I asked him about it. Dolan turned his head and looked at her directly. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know yet. It means I'm watching." She finally pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Whoever sold that route, they didn't do it once. You don't build that kind of operation for a single mission. They've been doing it. Other teams may have been hit. We might be the first to come back and talk about it." That sat in the air between them like something cold and heavy. "I'll pull everything I can through informal channels," Dolan said quietly. "People I trust. Keep it short. The fewer people who know you're looking, the better." He nodded, then after a moment, "Get some rest, Sergeant." She almost told him she was fine. The words were forming, then she stopped them. "Yeah," she said instead. He left. She lay back on the cot and stared at the canvas ceiling of the medical tent and listened to the bass sound generators' distant voices, the occasional aircraft, and did not sleep. Her mind wouldn't turn off. It kept running the ambush backward and forward, looking for the exact point of failure, the exact moment where the intelligence had to have been provided. The route had been finalized 18 hours before deployment. That narrowed the window. The number of people with access to the finalized route in that 18-hour window was not large. She was still running through names when the tent flap opened again and someone she didn't recognize stepped inside. Not a medic, not military bearing. Civilian clothes, mid-40s, the kind of carefully neutral expression that people in certain occupations spent years developing. He had a lanyard with a badge she couldn't read from the cot, and he carried nothing in his hands. "Sergeant Hale," he said, not a question. She sat up. "Who are you?" "My name is Garrett. I work with an interagency task force that's been tracking the group that ambushed your unit." He sat down in the medic's chair without being invited, the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being in rooms where his authority wasn't formally established, but was implicitly understood. "I've been trying to reach your command for 3 weeks. Before today, we had no surviving witnesses from a direct encounter with this group." She looked at him steadily. "And now you have 6. "Now I have 6, he paused, "and one who shot their commander from 2,900 meters. "What do you want, Garrett?" "Information, and your help." He leaned forward. "The group that took your squad isn't a regional militia. They're a contracted intelligence extraction team. Private, extremely well-funded. They've been operating in this theater for 14 months. We believe they have already acquired through ambush or other means 7 other special operations personnel. None of those 7 have been located." The number hit her like something physical. 7. 7 soldiers taken alive, not returned, not recovered. 7 people whose families had been given some version of a story that wasn't the full story. What do they want with them, she said. Knowledge extraction, he said simply. Interrogation. These are highly trained special operations soldiers. The intelligence value of what's inside their heads, operational doctrine contact networks, mission architecture is enormous on the open market. Your squad was targeted specifically because of a recent operation they'd been involved in. Someone wanted to know exactly what Echo Squad knew about a particular network in this region. The insider, she said. He didn't look surprised that she had already arrived there. Yes, we believe the insider has been active for approximately 8 months. We have a short list. How short? He looked at her for a moment, making a decision. 4 names. Is Webb on it? The pause that followed was less than 1 second. She counted it exactly. I can't confirm or deny individual names during an open investigation. That's a yes, she said. He didn't correct her. She stood up from the cot. Her legs were stiff and her ribs sent a sharp objection through her right side that she acknowledged and ignored. What do you need from me? A debrief. Everything from the moment you first detected the ambush. Every detail you can give me about the formation, the equipment, the command behavior, the communication setup. He paused. And I need it before your command debrief in, he checked his watch, 43 minutes. Because some of what's said in that room may need to be managed carefully. She understood what he was saying. He was telling her that the command debrief was potentially compromised, that whatever she said in that room might be heard by someone who shouldn't hear it. You're asking me to give you the unedited version before I give them the managed version, she said. I'm asking you to be careful about what you confirm to people whose clearance status we're still evaluating, he said. It was a more precise way of saying the same thing. She thought about Webb's face when she'd asked who knew their route, the calculation behind his eyes, the hand on her arm redirecting. She sat back down on the cot. Start recording. Garrett reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small device on the cot between them. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. I'm going to start from before the marsh, she said, because the route decision wasn't made at the marsh. The route decision was made at the briefing. And I'm going to tell you everything I remember about who was in that room. He nodded. That's exactly where I need you to start. She started talking. She told him everything. The briefing room, the people present, the exact language used to describe the route, the timing, the squad composition. She told him about the ambush, every detail she had observed through the scope, the coordination of the smoke grenades, the professionalism of the extraction team, the specific formation they used to manage the prisoner group. She told him about the tripwire seated along the approach route. She told him about the vehicle that had tried to block the ground exit and the communications array she had destroyed. He asked questions. Good ones. The kind that came from someone who already knew a significant portion of the picture and was filling specific gaps. 22 minutes in, he asked, the commander you shot, before he went down, did he make any communications? Did you observe him on a radio in the minutes prior to your first shot? She thought back. He was speaking to someone near the entrance before he turned back toward the prisoner column. I couldn't determine if it was in person or via radio from that distance. Was there anyone with him who might have been operating communications equipment? There was a second person near the entrance, shorter civilian gear rather than military. I didn't have a clear angle. Garrett made a note. Civilian gear. You're sure? Different cut. No load-bearing vest, no helmet, just a heavy coat and what looked like a bag, possibly equipment. She paused. I dismissed it as a station employee at the time, a non-combatant. That's civilian, Garrett said. Maybe more important than the commander you shot. She absorbed that. You know who it is. We have a theory. He picked up the recording device. Sergeant Hale, I'm going to ask you to do something that is going to feel wrong. In your debrief with Colonel Webb, he checked again, 19 minutes, I need you to omit the civilian. Don't mention the person near the entrance. Say your angle was obscured before the first shot. She stared at him. If our theory is correct, he said, the civilian at that station was communicating with someone inside this base. If that communication channel learns that you identified a civilian figure at the scene, that individual will disappear before we can locate them. You're asking me to lie in an official debrief. I'm asking you to omit one detail temporarily to protect an active investigation. Those are different things to lawyers, she said. They're the same thing to me. He held her gaze. I know. I'm asking anyway. She looked at the canvas wall of the tent for a long moment. Outside, she could hear boots on gravel, the bass moving around its routines, unaware of the conversation happening 6 meters away. If I do this, she said slowly, and you're wrong about the civilian, if this isn't what you think it is, you've compromised my integrity and an official record for nothing. Yes. And if you're right about the civilian and I don't omit it, your target disappears and 7 other soldiers who are currently being held somewhere don't come home. That's the calculation, he said. She hated that it was the right calculation. She hated that she could see the math clearly and that the math led to only one answer. 19 minutes, she said. Give me the debrief version. Walk me through what you need me to say and what you need me to not say. He did. She listened with the same focused stillness she brought to everything: scope, trajectory, target, outcome. It was all the same fundamental process. Define the variables, calculate the correction, accept the margin of error, press the trigger. When he finished, she said, one condition. Tell me. When this is done, when you found your civilian and identified your insider and closed this investigation, I get told, Antes, everything. I don't get a summary, I get the full picture. Because my squad was used as bait whether you intended that or not, and I need to understand the complete shape of what that was. Agreed in writing. He almost smiled. You don't trust verbal agreements. I don't trust anything I can't verify through a scope, she said. He took out a card and wrote something on the back and handed it to her. A contact number, a code word, and underneath it, in small, precise handwriting, the words full disclosure upon closure. G. She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it once and put it in the breast pocket of the dry jacket they'd given her, pressing it flat against her chest. 14 minutes, Garrett said, standing. I know. She stood with him. Her ribs said something sharp, and she let it pass through. One more thing. Sergeant, the 7 soldiers, she said, the ones who haven't come back. Do you have any reason to believe they're still alive? He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. We believe at least 4 of them are. We don't have confirmation on the remaining 3. 4, possibly 4 out of 7 still alive, held somewhere in a system that knew how to take people and disappear them completely, a system that had been operating for 14 months, a system that had a connection point somewhere inside the base she was standing on. Then you need to move faster, she said. I know, he said, and for the first time since he'd walked into the tent, his voice carried something that sounded like it had weight to it, like it wasn't just professional. I know. He left. She stood in the middle of the medical tent for a moment and then sat back down on the cot and pressed her palms together and felt the lingering damage in her fingers and thought about 4 soldiers in a place she couldn't see from any ridge, in any weather, with any rifle in the world. She thought about what it meant to be taken alive and held by people who treated other human beings as intelligence commodities. She thought about the 7 days between first capture and the kind of psychological breaking that professional interrogators could achieve in a controlled environment. She thought about soldiers who had been trained to resist and what happened when resistance met sufficient time and sufficient expertise. She pressed her hands harder together. The debrief was in 12 minutes. She stood up, straightened the jacket, and walked toward the entrance of the tent. She paused at the flap turned back and picked up the empty cup that had held the hot liquid they'd given her. She held it for a moment, then she set it down carefully. She had told the truth to Garrett, every word of it, and in 12 minutes she was going to walk into a room with Colonel Webb and 2 staff officers she didn't recognize and give them a version of that truth with a single detail, missing a figure in a heavy coat near a doorway 3 kilometers away. And she was going to do it without hesitation and without her face showing anything. Because that was the shot she'd been given. Not the one she'd chosen, the one the situation had handed her. And she had never missed a shot she'd been handed. She stepped out of the tent into the cold air of the base and walked toward the command building and did not slow down. The command building was warm in the way that institutional spaces are warm, not comfortable, just not cold. Didn't I mean? Fluorescent light folding chairs, a table that had seen too many debriefs to carry any particular weight about one more. Webb was already seated when she walked in. The two staff officers she didn't recognize sat on either side of him like bookends. A recording device sat in the center of the table already running. She sat down across from all three of them and put her hands flat on the table. "Sergeant Hale," Webb began, "before we start, I want to say on behalf of this command, what you did today was extraordinary." "I'd like to get through the debrief," she said. He blinked. Then he nodded. "Of course." The first staff officer, a major whose name she didn't catch and didn't ask for, leaned forward. "Let's start from your Overwatch position. Walk us through everything from initial detection." She talked for 31 minutes. She was precise. She was thorough. She described the marsh that silenced the first glint in the left tree line. She described the ambush formation, the smoke deployment, the professional coordination of the capture team. She described her shots, numbers, angles, confirmed drops. She described the ice, the fall, the recovery. She described the tracking through the frozen terrain, the tripwire, the high position she'd established on the rocky ridge. She described the prisoner column, the communications array she'd destroyed, the vehicle block she'd partially disrupted. She described the shot at 2,897 meters in the 4.1 seconds she had counted in her head before the commander went down. She did not describe the figure in the heavy coat near the entrance. Webb's face throughout was controlled, professional. He asked clarifying questions at appropriate intervals, questions that felt genuine on the surface, the kind any commanding officer would ask. She answered each one with the same level of precision. She watched his eyes. She watched the slight tension in his jaw when she described destroying the communications array. She watched the way he held very still when she mentioned the vehicle that had tried to block the ground exit. People reveal themselves in stillness as much as in motion. She had learned that through a scope over years of watching people who didn't know they were being watched. Webb's stillness in the wrong places was a language she was reading in real time. When the debrief concluded, the second staff officer, who had said almost nothing throughout, leaned forward and said, "Sergeant Hale, in your observation of the station prior to your first shot, were you able to identify any individuals at the station who appeared to be operating in a non-military capacity?" She looked at him steadily. "My angle on the entrance was partially obscured before the first shot. I was focused on the prisoner column and the commander. You had no visual on the entrance area." "I had a partial visual. Nothing I could characterize with confidence." The second staff officer wrote something down. Webb watched her. She watched Webb. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said finally. "Get some rest." She stood, nodded once, and walked out. In the hallway outside the command building, she stopped and stood against the wall and took 3 slow breaths. Her heart rate had been elevated for the last 31 minutes in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Sitting still and managing what came out of her mouth while watching a man who might have sold her squad's lives had cost her more than the 3-kilometer shot. The shot had been physics. This had been something else. She pushed off the wall and went back toward the medical tent. Not because she needed medical attention, but because it was the most logical place to pass through on the way to the temporary quarters they'd assigned her. She wanted to check on Yoon. She wanted to see Ferris's status. She wanted the simple, factual reassurance of counting her people and confirming that the numbers still added up. Yoon was sitting up on a cot with his left leg in a compression wrap and an IV in his right arm that he was clearly tolerating under protest. When he saw her walk in, he straightened immediately, the reflex of someone who still felt accountable to rank even while attached to a saline drip. "Sergeant," he said, "lie back down, Yoon." He didn't. "They're saying 6 weeks before I can return to field status." "They're probably being optimistic," she said. She pulled up the medic's chair and sat across from him. "The satellite handset, walk me through it." His face shifted, a kind of concentrated recollection replaying the sequence. "When they pushed me toward the building, I figured the external comms were already bought. I heard 2 shots hit the relay before they grabbed me. But a station that size, fixed installation, they'd have a backup. Regulation says hardened communication sites carry a minimum of 2 independent systems. I went for the back office because that's where backup equipment is always stored in structures of that classification. You knew the classification of that station. I'd reviewed the area intelligence before deployment." He said it simply, without performance. "It's what you're supposed to do." She looked at him for a moment. 22 years old, half her experience, and he had walked through a hostile building with half-free hands and a damaged leg and operated on intelligence he'd reviewed pre-mission because it was what you were supposed to do. "The tie," she said. When did you cut it? He almost smiled. They had a bulletin board in the back office, one of those old metal push-pin frames with a sharp corner bracket. I used about 40 seconds of their confusion about the sniper to work the plastic against it. He flexed his wrist, the muscle memory of the motion. I've practiced that. Self-release from zip restraints. I've practiced it probably 100 times because I read an account from a soldier who spent 4 days captured and said it was the one thing he wished he'd drilled before deployment. She said nothing for a moment, then Yoon, you did well today. He looked at the IV line. Ferris is in surgery. They're saying he keeps the arm. He let that out through his nose. The particular exhale of relief that people make when they've been holding their breath around something they haven't admitted to themselves. I saw him go down. I didn't know if he's alive. Okay. He pressed his eyes closed briefly. Okay. She left him and crossed to the surgical tent and confirmed through the attending medic that Ferris was post-op stable, expected full recovery with long-term physical therapy for the shoulder. The bullet had done significant damage to the musculature, but missed the joint. He would be in pain for months. He would heal. She went to her assigned quarters, a partitioned section of a larger prefab structure, a cot and a footlocker, and a hook on the wall, and sat on the cot and put her back against the wall and stared at nothing in particular. Garrett's card was in her breast pocket. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to look at it. She had memorized the number and the code word the moment she'd read them, the way she memorized everything that might matter later. She was still sitting like that, not sleeping, not thinking in any organized way, just existing in the particular suspended state that follows sustained extreme stress when the door to her quarters opened without a knock. Webb, alone, no staff officers, no recording device. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him and stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in any previous interaction. It was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was committed to it. You talked to someone before the debrief, he said, not a question. She kept her voice completely level. I talked to a medic, I talked to Dolan, I talked to Yoon. Someone else. I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was running continuously. She could see it, a man assessing how much she knew, how much she'd revealed, how much danger she currently represented to whatever arrangement he was managing. She returned his gaze with the flattest possible expression, giving him nothing to read, which was itself a form of information he would process correctly if he was as intelligent as she believed him to be. Raina, he said, and the use of her first name was deliberate. A shift in register, a move towards something that wanted to present itself as personal confidence. What happened today was a serious operational failure. The investigation is going to go deep. People are going to be looking for explanations for someone to hold responsible. I need to know that the people on my team are giving me complete information. My debrief was complete, she said. Is there anything you observed that you didn't include in the formal record? There it was, the direct question. Precise, specific, the kind of question that only gets asked when someone already suspects the answer is yes. She looked at him with the same absolute stillness she brought to a shot at maximum range. No, she said. He held her gaze for 4 seconds. Then he nodded once, turned and left. She waited 30 seconds after the door closed. Then she took out Garrett's card, looked at the number once more and put it back. Webb had come to her quarters alone off the record to ask a question he already knew the answer to. That wasn't the behavior of a commanding officer conducting an investigation. That was the behavior of a man managing exposure. He hadn't come to gather information. He had come to assess whether she was a threat. She was. She just needed 48 more hours. Those 48 hours proved to be the longest she could remember since a deployment 3 years earlier, when she'd waited 4 days in a static position for a target that never arrived. Waiting was its own form of warfare. It required the same discipline as the shot, the same controlled suppression of every instinct that told you to move to act to force the situation into resolution before it was ready. She kept her routines. She ate. She attended the follow-up medical checks without complaint. She visited Ferris in recovery and sat with him for 20 minutes while he was still largely unconscious, just so that when he woke up, there was a familiar face in the room. She worked with Dolan on their informal parallel inquiry, cross-referencing the names of personnel with briefing access against movement records, looking for patterns that might confirm what Garrett had already assessed. On the second day, Dolan found something. He came to her in the mess, sat across from her with a tray he didn't touch, and kept his voice at the precise volume that disappeared into ambient noise. Webb signed off on a communication record the night before our deployment. Outbound, encrypted routing through a civilian relay. The record exists because he used base infrastructure. He tried to route it clean, but the base system logs everything encrypted, or not, because that's what the base system does. She set down her fork. Who received it? That's the part I can't get to. The routing strips the destination. But the timestamp is 41 minutes after the mission file was finalized. 41 minutes. The mission file finalized, and 41 minutes later, a communication routed out through civilian infrastructure. 41 minutes was enough time to encode the route, the timing, the squad composition, and transmit it to people who had the resources and the lead time to build an ambush. Garrett needs this, she said. I know. I don't know how to reach Garrett. She looked at him. I do. She made contact through the method Garrett had established, the code word left in a specific communication channel. He had described the kind of low-signature signaling that intelligence operations used when they couldn't afford direct contact. She didn't know how he received it or how long it would take him to respond. It took 4 hours. He appeared at the base the way he disappeared, without visible arrival, without announcement. She found a note under the door of her quarters with a location and a time. She went. He was in a storage structure at the far end of the base's maintenance area, a legitimate space used for equipment, also a space with no internal surveillance because it had been categorized as non-sensitive. He had clearly assessed the base's coverage gaps before she had. She handed him Dolan's documentation on the communication record. He read it without expression. This is enough to move, he said. How soon? Tonight, if I can get my team positioned. He folded the document carefully. There's a complication. She waited. The civilian you didn't describe in your debrief, he said. We identified them from other intelligence. A woman named Soren, mid-level logistics contractor, security clearance, current embedded with regional supply operations for 11 months. She was the communication link between Webb and the extraction team. Webb provided the mission intelligence. Soren relayed it through her contracting channels to the team in the field. He paused. Soren was at the ranger station to personally confirm the delivery of your squad. She wanted to verify the product before payment was finalized. The product. Her squad. 6 soldiers referred to in a transaction as product. She kept her face completely still. Where is Soren now? Still on base. She's been here for 2 weeks under her contracting credentials. She arrived before your mission deployed. He looked at her. She was here when the mission file was written. She gave Webb the contact. Or Webb gave her the network. We're not entirely sure which direction that relationship runs. What we know is that together they've facilitated at least 3 successful acquisition operations against special operations units in this theater. 3, plus her own, 4 operations, and 7 soldiers still unaccounted for across those previous 3. The 7 soldiers, she said, finding them is that part of what tonight accomplishes. Soren knows where the holding facility is. Webb may or may not know the specifics. He was likely kept away from operational details for his own security. But Soren knows. He held her gaze. When we take her, she will be given significant incentive to provide that location. Significant incentive, she repeated. Legal significant incentive, he said without inflection. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, What do you need from me tonight? Nothing, he said. This part isn't your operation. Webb came to my quarters. He assessed me. If he's monitoring my movements and I'm not where he expects me to be when this goes down, he'll know something is happening, Garrett finished. Yes, which is why I need you to be exactly where you'd normally be tonight. In your quarters, lights off at your usual time. Nothing that reads as anything other than a soldier in recovery sleeping. And you'll move on him while I'm doing that. We'll move on both of them simultaneously. Webb first because he has the ability to alert Soren if he realizes he's being approached. Soren second within 60 seconds of Webb's containment. She thought about it. Every part of her that had been running on the fuel of knowing and waiting and holding still wanted to be in the room when it happened. Wanted to see the look on Webb's face when the calculation finally resolved against him. She was human enough to want that, Fisto. She was disciplined enough to let it go. 60 seconds between the two, she said. That's a tight window. It's the window we have. If Webb has a secondary alert system, a dead man's switch, or a prearranged signal he sends on a regular interval. We've assessed that risk. His communication pattern over the past 72 hours shows no regular interval signaling. He paused. But you're right to flag it. We'll have someone on Soren from the moment we approach Webb, not after. Good. She turned to leave. He stopped her with a word. Hail. She turned back. The shot you made today, he said, and for a moment the professional neutral expression he wore like armor was set aside and there was something underneath it that was simply a person speaking to another person. 2,900 meters, in that wind, with body temperature where yours was. He shook his head slightly. I've been in this work for 19 years. I've read after-action reports from every major theater in the modern era. I've read accounts of the longest confirmed shots on record. He stopped. What you did today isn't in any manual. She looked at him. It worked, she said. That's the only part that matters. That's what you said about it before. It's the same answer. He nodded slowly. Get some rest, Sergeant. She left him in the storage structure and walked back across the base under a sky that had gone fully dark and breathtakingly clear. The kind of sky that appears in extreme cold when the atmosphere strips itself of everything that isn't essential. She walked at her normal pace. She nodded to two soldiers she passed. She went to the mess and got a coffee she didn't particularly want and drank half of it at a table where she was visible to anyone monitoring her movements. Then she went to her quarters. She set her boots by the door. She lay down on the cot in her clothes. She put one arm over her eyes. She did not sleep. At 11:47, she heard boots in the hallway outside her door. Not the random sound of bass movement, but a specific pattern. Multiple people, moving with the controlled urgency of a unit executing a timed operation. She heard a door open further down the corridor. She heard a voice not loud, not aggressive, the quiet, commanding tone of an authority that doesn't need to perform itself. Then silence. At 11:49, she heard the same pattern of boots, different direction, moving away from the main building, moving toward the contractor accommodations on the base's east side. She lay still and counted seconds. At 11:53, her door opened. She was sitting up before it fully opened, her body moving before she'd consciously directed it, the combat conditioned response to unexpected entry, overriding everything else. Garrett stood at the doorway. He looked at her sitting up on the cot in the dark and said two words. We're clear. She exhaled. Both of them, she said. Both. Simultaneous within 40 seconds of each other. No alert was transmitted. Sorena's equipment has been secured. He paused. She's already talking. She started before we finished reading her the relevant statutes. She talked about the holding facility location for 11 minutes before we could get a recorder into the room. 11 minutes. A woman who had coordinated the capture and sale of soldiers as intelligence product had lasted 11 minutes before deciding that her own situation mattered more than her network. The 7 soldiers, Raina said. We have a location. A team is being scrambled in the next 2 hours. It's not my operation. It goes to a unit with different resources and different authorities. But the location is solid. Soren gave us too many specific details for it to be misdirection. She's not protecting anyone. She's protecting herself. Raina sat on the edge of the cot and pressed her feet flat on the floor and felt the cold of the ground come up through her socks. She thought about 7 soldiers in a facility somewhere, in whatever condition 14 months of this kind of operation produced. She thought about the ones Garrett had said might still be alive. She thought about the 3 he hadn't confirmed. Tell me when you know about the 3, she said, the ones you couldn't confirm. You'll be on the list. She nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. Webb, she said. When this becomes official, when the investigation goes formal, and command is notified what happens to his record. Garrett looked at her from the doorway. Why should he? Because he signed my commendations. Both of them. And I want to know whether anything he signed is going to be challenged retroactively because of what he was doing. He was quiet for a moment. Your record stands independent of his, he said. What you earned, you earned. Nothing he signed into existence and nothing we found in that room tonight changes what happened in that valley today. She looked at him steadily. What you did out there, he said, doesn't need anyone's signature to be real. He left. She sat in the dark for a long time. The base had gone quiet around her, the late-hour quiet that bases settle into when the urgent business of a crisis has passed and the machinery of processing and recovery takes over. She could hear the distant sound of a generator. She could hear faintly what might have been voices from the medical tent, the low rhythm of personnel working through the night. Ferris was in there sleeping off surgery. Yun was in there with his leg wrapped in his IV and his inability to stay lying down. Dolan was somewhere on this base, probably not sleeping, either running the same long retrospective loop that she was running the marsh. The smoke, the moment the ice gave way, all of it. Kovac and Reyes and Blackwood were somewhere on this base carrying whatever they were carrying from the hours in captivity that she hadn't been present for and would never fully understand from the outside. Her squad, all of them intact, alive on the same base she was on. She lay back down. Her hands ached with the deep chronic ache of push-to-limit tissue demanding its due. She pressed them flat against the cot on either side of her and felt the resistance of something solid beneath her, and let that simple physical fact be enough for this moment. She had done the thing. The investigation would do its thing. The rescue operation would do its thing. The pieces were in motion in directions she couldn't control and wouldn't try to. She closed her eyes. This time she slept. She woke at 5:43 in the morning without an alarm, the way she always woke, not gradually, not through the slow surfacing of someone pulled from deep sleep, but all at once, completely present, her eyes open and her mind already running. The ache in her hands was specific and detailed, cataloging every tendon she had pushed past its limit in the past 36 hours. Her ribs informed her immediately of their status. Her shoulder, which she had still not mentioned to any medic, had stiffened overnight into something that would require deliberate management before it became a problem she couldn't manage. She sat up and worked her fingers slowly. Open, close, open, close. The fine motor control was coming back in increments, still not where she needed it, not sniper ready, but functional. She would take functional. The base was already in motion when she stepped outside. She could feel it before she saw it, a particular quality of activity that was different from yesterday's crisis energy. This was the organized movement of people processing new information. People who had heard something overnight that had changed the shape of what they were working with. She went to the mess first. Coffee, actual food which she hadn't managed properly in nearly 2 days. She sat alone at the end of a table and ate with the methodical efficiency of someone refueling rather than eating, and she listened to the room around her. It took 4 minutes to understand what had shifted. The word moving through the base wasn't Webb's arrest that was being held tightly. Official channels only not yet released to general personnel. The word moving through the base was rescue. Somewhere in the pre-dawn hours, a team had moved on a location and come back with people. The details were incomplete and variously distorted by the telephone effect of base communication, but the core of it was consistent soldiers who had been missing had been found. She set down her fork. Found alive, that was the version she was hearing most consistently. She didn't know the number yet. She didn't know which of the 7 or how many of the 3 Garrett hadn't been able to confirm. She sat with not knowing and finished her food and drank the coffee and waited for something she could verify. Dolan found her 20 minutes later. He came through the mess door with the specific energy of a man carrying information he had been physically holding in his body, and he sat across from her without getting food and put both hands on the table. 6, he said. They got 6 out of the facility, alive. She put down the coffee cup. 6, she said. The 7th, he stopped. 1 didn't make it before the rescue team arrived. The team's assessment is that it happened sometime in the last 48 hours. He pressed his jaw together for a moment. They're not releasing the name to general population yet. Next of kin first. One soldier who had gone into that facility and hadn't come out. 1 person whose family was going to receive a visit from a uniformed officer sometime today, a knock on a door that would change everything on the other side of it permanently. She thought about that soldier for a long time. She didn't know who it was. She wouldn't know until the name was released. But she held the fact of that person's existence, a soldier who had been taken, who had been held, who had not been recovered in time, and she let that weight be what it was without trying to reduce it. 6, she said again, quieter. 6, Dolan confirmed, and Garrett's team moved on Webb and the contractor simultaneously last night. That's just starting to filter through command. There's going to be a formal announcement within the hour, Webb's removal from command, full investigation, disclosure, the works. She nodded. Are you okay? He said. She looked at him. It was a question that people asked each other all the time and meant almost nothing most of the time. Dolan asked it the way he did everything, directly, specifically, meaning exactly what he said. I'm working on it, she said. He accepted that. There's something else. General Harmon is here. She went still. Harmon arrived 40 minutes ago. Direct flight from regional command. He's been briefed on the full operation, the ambush, the rescue, Garrett's investigation, Webb, all of it. Dolan paused. He asked for you by name, specifically, before he asked for anyone else. General Harmon was not a name she associated with her own career in any direct way. He was 2 full command levels above where her daily operations existed. He was the kind of officer whose name appeared in briefings as context, not as someone who would ever have occasion to ask for a sergeant by name. Where? She said. Command building, 20 minutes. She stood up, looked down at her clothes, still the base issue dry gear from the day before. She hadn't had time to retrieve anything from her original kit, most of which had been either submerged or left on the ridge. She straightened the jacket as well as it would straighten. You look fine, Dolan said. I know, she said. She walked to the command building. The room they put her in was not the debrief room from yesterday. It was a different space, smaller, with a window, which was unusual. General Marcus Harmon was 61 years old, built like a man who had never stopped doing what he'd done at 30, with a face that had absorbed enough of the world's difficulty to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He was standing when she walked in, which she hadn't expected. He extended his hand, which she also hadn't expected. She shook it. Sergeant Hale, he said. Sit down. They both sat. I've read the full after action from last night and this morning, he said. Garrett's debrief of you, the communication record, your squad member located the timeline of Webb's involvement, the facility rescue. He looked at her directly. And I've read the ballistic assessment. The ballistic assessment, she said, of your shot. Military ballistics team ran the numbers this morning from the data in your scope's internal recorder combined with the meteorological data from yesterday's conditions. He set a single sheet of paper on the table between them. 2,897 meters, confirmed impact, under the recorded wind conditions. He tapped the paper. 3 of the 4 ballistics officers who reviewed it said it wasn't possible. The 4th said it was possible but required a combination of skill and calculation at a level they'd never personally encountered. She looked at the paper. The numbers on it were her numbers, the same numbers she had run in her head on that frozen ridge while the prisoner column moved toward the station below. I used her hair, she said. Harmon looked at her. I'm sorry, Madeleine, as wind indicators. I tied strands to a branch to read the lower air currents. She paused. The numbers worked out. He looked at her for a long moment and something moved across his face that she recognized only because she had seen a version of it on Dolan's face in the medical tent, the expression of a person trying to fit something large into a frame that wasn't built for it. The 6 survivors from the facility, she said. What's their status? 5 are in stable condition injuries consistent with the conditions of their detention. 1 is critical but expected to survive. They're being transported to a full medical facility within the hour. He paused. Because of the location Soren provided in the speed with which the rescue team moved, the medical assessment is that all 6 surviving soldiers receive care within the survivable window. The survivable window, a phrase that had a specific technical meaning in field medicine and a much larger meaning everywhere else. Soren's information was accurate, Raina said, completely, which is why her cooperation agreement is being honored as much as that particular outcome sits poorly with everyone involved. He folded his hands on the table. Sergeant Hale, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. When Webb came to your quarters alone off the record the night of your debrief, what did he say? She told him, word for word, because she had memorized the exchange the moment it happened, the way she memorized everything that might matter. Harmon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And you told him you had nothing to add to the official record? Yes. At that point, you were actively withholding information from him at Garrett's direction? Yes. You understood the risk that represented to your own position if the investigation didn't resolve correctly. I calculated it. He looked at her. And you made the call anyway. The calculation had a clear answer, she said. It wasn't comfortable, but it was clear. That seems to be a pattern with you, he said, and it wasn't quite humor and it wasn't quite not. She said nothing. He opened a folder in front of him that she hadn't noticed until now. He took out a document and slid it across the table toward her. She read it. She read it twice. It was a formal recommendation, not a draft, not a proposal, a completed recommendation with Harmon's signature already on it for Sergeant Raina Hale to be advanced in rank for her actions in the Valley and her role in the subsequent intelligence operation to be entered into the classified record at the highest applicable level, and for her 2,897-meter shot to be formally documented as the longest confirmed precision sniper impact in the recorded history of this command's operational theater. She set the paper down. The record, she said carefully. There are longer shots on record in other theaters. Confirmed shots, he said, under these conditions, with this equipment, with this level of independent verification. He paused. The ballistics team's report goes into the classified archive. The shot goes into the classified record. Your name goes with it. Another pause. Classified for now, possibly for a long time. The nature of what Garrett's team uncovered means much of this remains protected until the broader investigation concludes. I understand. Your squad has been informed that you'll be recognized. The specifics are classified, but they know what it means. He looked at her steadily. Dolan submitted a supplemental report this morning. He documented the full sequence from his perspective. His account of your actions on that ridge is... Harmon stopped choosing the word carefully, thorough. She thought about Dolan sitting on the floor of the medical tent, with his chin cut and his field gear still on, saying what he'd said about the shot. Thorough. She could imagine what thorough looked like from Dolan, and something in her chest did something complicated. There's one more thing, Harmon said, and this one I want you to think about before you answer. She waited. Garrett's investigation will continue for some time. The network that Webb and Soren were connected to extends beyond this theater. There are other people in other positions who facilitated what happened to your squad and to the 7 soldiers before them. He looked at her steadily. Garrett has formally requested that you be seconded to his task force as a field consultant during the investigation's operational phase. You would continue in your current rank. Your operational role would be advisory and direct action as determined by mission requirements. He paused. He was specific about wanting you, not someone like you. She looked at the window. Outside, the base was continuing its morning. Personnel moving between structures. The distant sound of vehicles. A completely ordinary collection of sounds that existed in the same world as everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. The investigation, she said. Garrett said there are other theaters, other operations by this network. Yes, other soldiers potentially in the same position as the 7. It's a reasonable concern, Harmon said carefully. We don't have confirmed intelligence on that yet, but it's a reasonable concern. She looked back at him. She thought about the spotter she'd lost 3 years ago. She had carried that loss as proof of something, proof that her judgment cost lives, that her confidence was a liability, that the correct response to being trusted with other people's survival was to stop letting people get close enough to be trusted to her. She had built her entire operational identity around that proof. Solo overwatch, controlled distance, calculations only. Never let the human variable into the equation, because the human variable was the one she couldn't predict or protect. Except Yoon had been a human variable. Running toward a hostile building on a broken leg with half-free hands, because he'd read a field report about a soldier who hadn't drilled self-release from zip restraints, and he didn't want to be that soldier. Dolan had been a human variable, looking back at the ridgeline from the helicopter skid, counting heads, making sure every one of his people was on board before he stepped off the ground. Ferris had been a human variable, crawling through frozen dirt after a bullet had gone through his shoulder, not stopping, just continuing to move because that was what you did. She had saved them, and they had, in their way, saved her not from the valley, but from the version of herself that had been planning to stay alone on that ridge forever. I'll do it, she said. Harmon nodded once. I'll tell Garrett. She stood. He stood with her and again extended his hand, and again she shook it. Sergeant Hale, he said. One last thing, off the record, personal observation. She waited. In 33 years, I've given orders to a lot of soldiers who I knew were going to face something that scared me on their behalf. Situations where I signed the paperwork and then spent the next several hours not looking at my watch, because looking at my watch made the wait worse. He held her gaze. Yesterday was one of those days. I was in regional command when the first transmission came in about Echo Squad's situation. I knew where that squad was. I knew the terrain. I knew what the odds looked like. He paused. And then the second transmission came in with the impact confirmation on the commander. And I was looking at a ballistics preliminary that didn't make sense to me. And someone on my staff said, General, we think there's a sniper still operational in the valley. And I asked where, and they gave me the estimated position from the shot trajectory. And I looked at the map, and I looked at the distance, and I said, that is not possible. He stopped. I was wrong, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, the numbers worked out. He almost smiled. Yes, they did. She left the command building and walked back into the morning air and stood still for a moment, letting the cold settle around her the way it always did, finding it where it was. Dolan was waiting outside. He'd known the meeting time, or he'd been watching the building, or both. He was leaning against the exterior wall with his arms crossed and his face doing the particular thing it did when he was pretending to be casual while actually paying close attention to everything. Well, he said, Harmon signed the recommendation. Dolan looked at her without speaking for a moment. His jaw did something, a brief tightening, the physical expression of a feeling he was choosing not to fully verbalize. Then he said, good. Garrett wants me seconded to the task force. I know. He asked me first. I told him you'd say yes. She looked at him. You told him I'd say yes before he asked me. I know how you calculate, Dolan said simply. She looked at the base around them. Personnel, moving vehicles, the ordinary machinery of a military installation processing the aftermath of something extraordinary. Somewhere in the medical tent, Yoon was arguing with a medic. Ferris was waking up in recovery. Kovac was probably eating enough food for 3 people the way he always did after an operation. Reyes and Blackwood were somewhere doing whatever they did in the hours after something like this. 6 soldiers alive because she'd been on a ridge with a rifle and 31 rounds, in a calculation that 3 of 4 ballistics officers had said was impossible. 1 soldier whose name she didn't know yet, whose family was receiving a knock on a door somewhere far from this frozen base. 6 more survivors from a facility that Soren had described in 11 minutes of self-protective detail. And a network that extended further than any of them had fully mapped, yet with other soldiers in other situations that hadn't been located or confirmed or resolved. The math wasn't finished. She understood that completely. The valley was closed. The investigation was open. She was good at waiting for the right moment. She was good at doing the math in conditions that made the math feel impossible. She was good at holding completely still while the situation resolved itself into the single frame where the correct action became clear. She would do that again. In whatever theater Garrett's investigation took them, for however long it took to map the full shape of what Webb and Soren had been part of, she would do it for the soldier whose name she didn't know yet. She would do it for the 6 who had come out of that facility alive. She would do it for the calculation she'd run on that ridge, not the ballistics calculation, the other one. The one she'd run when she was lying in the snow with ice still in her clothes and 31 rounds in a 3-kilometer impossibility between her and the people she was responsible for. The calculation that had come out the same way every time she'd run it. There was no version of this where she didn't try. Dolan pushed off the wall. Yoon's asking for you, he said. He wants to tell you something about the satellite handset model in the station. He read the technical specs this morning. I think he wants credit. He already has my credit, she said. Tell him that. Not me. She started walking toward the medical tent. Dolan fell in beside her. Raina, he said quietly enough that it was only for her. She looked at him. The spotter, he said. Michaels. She went still for 1 step, then kept walking. I knew him, Dolan said. Not well, different unit, but I knew him, and I've read what happened on that operation. I've known for a long time. He kept his voice level. It wasn't your call that cost him. The situation was already compromised before your trigger pulled. The investigation said that. The review said that. The only person who didn't accept what the review said was you. She kept walking. Her hands were in the jacket pockets. She pressed them against the lining and felt the resistance. I know what the review said, she said. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud anyway. Because yesterday you saved 6 people who were going to dim, and then you helped save 6 more who were already lost, and somewhere in between all of that, you were still carrying something that wasn't yours to carry. He paused. I'm not telling you to put it down. I'm telling you that you're allowed to. She walked 4 more paces before she said anything. He would have been good, she said. Michaels, he had the instincts. He just needed more time. I know. I keep thinking about what he would have become if he'd had more time. I know, Dolan said again. They reached the medical tent. She stopped at the entrance and turned and looked at Dolan directly. Thank you, she said, for the supplemental report. It was accurate, he said. I just wrote what happened. It was more than that, he held her gaze. Yeah, he said. Maybe it was. She went inside. Yun looked up from his cot the moment she entered, and his face did the thing that young soldiers' faces do when they're trying to appear composed and aren't entirely succeeding. He had a tablet on his lap, already doing something, already moving forward, incapable of being still, even with a drip in his arm and a wrapped leg, and he set it aside when she pulled up the chair. The handset, she said, tell me. He told her. He had a detailed technical energetic account of the specific satellite handset model in the back office, the frequency range. It operated on the encryption protocol. It used the 3 attempts he'd made before the connection went through, and the precise words he'd used when the operator answered, because there is a specific way you speak when you're in a hostile building with half-free hands and you need someone to move fast and you only have one chance to make them understand how fast. She listened to every word. When he finished, she said, what did the operators say when they heard your call sign? He paused. They said he stopped, something shifting in his expression to something less technical and more human. They said, copy that, we're coming. Copy that, we're coming. She looked at him for a moment. That's the job, she said. Someone gets cut off. Someone else says we're coming. That's the whole job. He looked at her with the expression of someone absorbing something that was going to stay with them. Then he said, they're calling you Silent Frost. She looked at him. Who is? Everyone. It started in the mess this morning. Dolan didn't start it. I asked him. It started with Kovac, I think. Or Reyes, someone who was in the prisoner column and watched what you did from the ground from inside it while it was happening. He paused. They said you moved through all of it without breaking. Like Frost. Like something that covers everything and changes the whole terrain but makes no sound. Silent Frost. She turned the name over. Not cold. That wasn't what they meant, and she understood that without needing it explained. Frost wasn't cold the way ice was cold, brutal, static, indiscriminate. Frost was precise. Frost appeared in the night and transformed the world by morning without anyone having heard it arrive. Frost moved at the molecular level, patient, an inevitable, finding every surface, covering every exposure, changing the entire face of the terrain without a single sound. That was what she had put in that valley. Not loudly, not violently in the performative sense, quietly and precisely, and without stopping, working through every surface of the problem until the terrain itself had changed. She looked at Yoon. Get some rest, she said. I'm not tired, he said immediately. I know, get some rest anyway. She stood and left the medical tent and walked back out into the morning. The sun was up now, fully the kind of hard winter sun that provides no warmth but absolute clarity, every surface bright and exact, every shadow sharp, the world rendered in precise detail. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the base and she breathed. She was alive. Her squad was alive. 6 soldiers who had been taken before them were alive. One was not, and she would carry that truth cleanly without making it smaller than it was. The investigation was open and would go where it went, and she would go with it because the math was the same math it had always been. Someone gets cut off. Someone says, we're coming. That's the whole job. The guilt she had carried for 3 years since Michael's, she could feel it still. It hadn't evaporated overnight because Dolan had named it. It didn't work like that, and she didn't expect it to. But it had shifted slightly in its weight, redistributed across a framework that was larger than it had been 48 hours ago, when she had been alone on a ridge with a rifle and 31 rounds and a calculation that shouldn't have worked. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't sure she was ready to fully know what to do with that. But she knew it. She felt it as a fact rather than a theory. The name followed her as she walked. She heard it twice more before she reached her quarters, said by people she passed, said, without ceremony, said the way names that fit a person perfectly get said, not as a title, as a recognition. Silent Frost. She had moved through the worst the valley could offer through ice water, an impossible distance, in frozen terrain and institutional betrayal, and the specific particular horror of watching the people she was responsible for being taken, and she had come out the other side without breaking. Not because she was cold, because she was precise. Because she knew how to hold still when stillness was required, and move when movement was the only correct answer, and calculate the margin when the margin looked like nothing. Because she had never once in any of it stopped believing the numbers would work out. She reached her quarters and pushed the door open and stood in the small, clean space of it, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't check the corners. She didn't assess the exits. She didn't catalog the variables. She just stood there. And the silence around her was not the silence of a marsh hiding something. It was not the silence of waiting for a shot. It was not the silence of a woman carrying something alone that was too heavy to carry alone. It was simply quiet. And for the first time in 3 years, that was enough. Raina Hale had gone into that valley as a sniper who trusted only her calculations. She came back as something the valley itself had named, and the name was not a title she'd been given, but a truth she'd earned one frozen step at a time across terrain that should have been the end of her, and wasn't. Because she had done the math, and the numbers had worked out, and she was still here. Sonnet 4.6 low.